Welcome to episode 302 of Angela Watson's Truth for Teachers. I'm your host, Angela Watson, and I'm here to speak encouragement into the hearts of educators and get you informed and energized for the week ahead. Today, I'm sharing a big picture view of what's happening in education, what I think is coming next, and what makes me optimistic about the profession of teaching. Visit truthforteachers.com for an easy-to-read, easy-to-share version of this podcast episode. If the IEP process is confusing for you as an educator and overwhelming for families, there's a new free resource that can help. Season 3 of the Understood Explains podcast is like a crash course on IEPs from the perspective of a teacher who's been there. Hosted by teacher and special education expert Juliana Urtubey, Understood Explains is demystifying the IEP process for families, with episodes explaining the difference between 504 plans and IEPs, how kids qualify for each type, and how to know if your child needs an IEP. It's a great overview for the general ed teacher and totally understandable for families who are unfamiliar with the IEP process. Understood Explains is also available in Spanish to support multilingual families and help them advocate for their kids. And it's all free. To listen to Understood Explains, search for Understood Explains in your podcast app. That's Understood Explains. One of the most interesting aspects of my work as an instructional coach and educational consultant is getting to observe and interact with educators all over the country, and sometimes even internationally. Teaching can be an isolating profession in which you don't really know if what's happening in your classroom is also happening to the teacher next door, much less the school down the road, and much less the folks across the state or country. And most schools operate in a little bit of a silo. They're so busy trying to meet the needs of their own community that there's not a lot of time or mental bandwidth to take a step back and ask, what are the larger factors impacting our work? How are other schools handling these challenges? And just as importantly, time to ask, how do we proactively prepare for what's next and create a vision for where we're heading instead of just trying to put out fires all the time? I have the privilege of being able to ask those questions and do that kind of work on a regular basis, and I want to share some of what I've uncovered with you today. If you enjoy this podcast format, please let me know, and I will do these kinds of episodes periodically. I'm thinking maybe once or twice a year, just to keep you in the loop with what's happening because it feels like there's so much change happening all the time, and I know it can get really overwhelming. Also, I present this information in a keynote that I often present at conferences and different school PD. So if this is a topic that interests you and that you think your colleagues would also benefit from hearing, just reach out to me at info@truthforteachers.com, and hopefully I'll get a chance to come work with you and talk with teachers at your school about these kinds of things. So we're going to be discussing the statistics around teacher vacancies, student enrollment, and budget forecasts, along with the implications for schools. I'll then analyze the trends and focuses that we'll be seeing more of in education in the coming years. I'm going to give you the more depressing news first, but don't worry, we're not going to stay there, and I'm going to spend a good portion of our time talking about things that make me hopeful. And I want you to know that my choice of wording in the title of this episode, The Future of Teaching, was very deliberate. I intentionally did not choose to frame this as the future of schooling, or the future of learning, or the future of education. Certainly we'll talk about all those things, but my focus really is on the future of teaching, because I feel like that gets lost so much in the message around everything for the kids. And obviously the purpose of school is to educate children, and they matter, but there are millions of dedicated adults who have chosen teaching as a career, and they matter too. The people doing this work of teaching matter, and finding ways to support, attract, retain teachers is important. And so that's why I really want to center teachers here. My advocacy is always centered around teachers. I try to find the overlap between what's best for kids and what's best for teachers, because I don't think those two things are diametrically opposed. And I don't think that it's negligent on behalf of students to focus on what their teachers need and what is the future of this career. If we don't see teaching as a valid career choice that is worthy of funding, of support, of resources, if we don't really consider who teachers are and their well-being and their work-life balance, then the profession crumbles, and that affects kids. So we need to get real about what's happening, and we do need to center teachers in the conversation sometimes. The people who are doing this work in schools are super, super important. So that's why we're looking at the future of teaching. And one quick note for our international listeners, this is a very American-centric episode, and I apologize for that. To try to do something like this for international trends would be a whole other can of worms and way out of my wheelhouse. So I do actually have an episode coming up in June with Pernille Rip about work-life balance in Danish schools. So check out episode 303 when that's out. Until then, let's get into staffing, budgets, and enrollment. So we're going to start by investigating all of the chatter about so-called teacher shortages. I'm always hesitant to use that term because I think there's less of a teacher shortage than a shortage of people who are willing to sign up for the high demands of the job at the current salary level and with so few resources and support. I think teacher vacancies is probably more accurate. But nevertheless, yes, we do continue to see fewer college students enrolling in teaching certification programs. And in the blog post that accompanies this article, there's a full transcript of everything that I'm saying, and I've also embedded various graphs and data to show you visually what it is that I'm talking about. And what you'll see is that there has been a steady decline in the amount of people choosing education as their major in college. Decades ago, this decline was partially due to more career options being available to women for the first time. But more recently, college students are pursuing business degrees and careers in STEM, which are some of the most profitable fields to work in. The decline in interest has led schools like Harvard and New Jersey City University to completely close their undergrad teaching programs. They don't train up new teachers there anymore. The University of South Florida had planned the same thing in 2020 due to budget cuts, but they reversed their decision in 2021 after pushback. Regardless, there are fewer prospective teachers entering the field. I think the data on that is pretty clear. This has contributed, though of course it's not the sole cause, to the high level of teacher vacancies. There are many unfilled teaching positions, and that's been the case for several years now. It's particularly true in high poverty communities and urban schools and in special education, science, math, and engineering. Will it stay that way? That's the question, right? The lead researcher of a multi-year study on teacher vacancies says that it's hard to predict. And here's a quote. "This is one of the things that we are continuing to work on. Forecasting the teacher turnover, as we're learning, is very, very hard. We think that teacher turnover is going to peak either last year or this year. And over the next couple of years, we think it's going to decrease. From 2021 to 2023, we did see a substantial increase in vacant positions, but it's unclear to me whether or not that's going to continue, in part because turnover might decrease, but also because some districts are using ESSER funds to hire teachers, and that's going to run out in September 2024. The last round of ESSER funds is wrapping up soon. ESSER stands for Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief. This is a federal initiative, if you're not familiar with this, that during the pandemic, lawmakers came up with a lot of extra money for K-12 schools through the ESSER funds. And this money came from three laws. There was the CARES Act of 2020, that was ESSER 1. There was the Coronavirus Response and Relief Supplemental Appropriations Act of 2021, that was ESSER 2. And the American Rescue Plan of 2021, which was ESSER 3. In total, schools got nearly $200 billion extra during the pandemic. The first two rounds of funds had already been used up, but the last round, ESSER 3, needs to be committed by September 2024. These funds were a big help for schools that were dealing with reopening challenges and supporting students' mental health and just making up for lost learning during the pandemic. The funds were given out based on the same formula as federal Title I funding, which gives more money to districts with lots of low-income families. The ESSER III funds were flexible, meaning that schools could use them in lots of different ways. In the states that reported data, and a lot of states did not report data on how they used their ESSER funds, about half of the ESSER III money went to paying employees. This included hiring new teachers, counselors, office workers, specialists, instructional coaches, as well as giving raises to try to retain staff. But if states don't find other money to keep paying these new workers that they've hired over the last couple of years, those folks might end up getting laid off. Schools also used ESSER funds to hire counselors, and they added programs to help with social and emotional learning. Some made the school day longer or added more days to the year to make up for, quote, lost learning time. Others spent money on training, technology, and teaching materials. But now, as school systems have to transition to more normal cash flows, school leaders have to decide whether to pare back on programs or supplies or lay off teachers, or maybe some combination of these. They need to find ways to replace the ESSER funds that were going toward learning and toward mental health initiatives so those can be preserved. When the ESSER funds run out, it's going to create a so-called financial cliff for school districts. This is especially true considering other financial problems like state tax cuts, diverting resources to school vouchers, and general economic uncertainty. Many Republican-governed states have broadened voucher programs over the last few years, allowing parents to send their kids to private schools using tax dollars, which means less money flowing to public schools. This has led to a renaissance of sorts for private schools, many of which have been seeing spikes in enrollment since 2020 and are finally getting the tuition dollars that they need. This could lead to tough choices in public schools, like laying off teachers, shutting down schools, or cutting important programs for students. So that's a little bit about teacher vacancies. Let's look at how this connects to declining enrollment. A large number of parents pulled their kids out of public schools in 2020 and 2021, and to a lesser extent over the past few years. Initially, the COVID restrictions were a big driver of this. If a local public school was continuing remote learning at a time when a local private school had chosen to reopen, many parents chose to switch to the private school. Homeschooling has also had a big surge in popularity during that time, and that has continued. We also saw many families temporarily or permanently relocate in 2020 and 2021 due to pandemic restrictions. Urban public schools lost up to 20% of their enrollment in some places, as families fled to less dense areas where the health risks were perceived as lower, if their primary concern was avoiding COVID, or where the pandemic restrictions were looser, if their primary concern was getting their kids back to normal in school. Urban school enrollment around the country has largely not bounced back since then, and that mirrors the population loss as a whole that most large American cities have been experiencing lately. All of this has led to a decline in student enrollment in many areas of the country. Another factor is the declining birth rates in the U.S. since 2012. In some places, this is offset by the number of immigrant families who are coming to the U.S. and enrolling their children in public schools, but the numbers are very uneven. Some communities have received influxes of migrant or refugee families, but this is not creating a huge public school enrollment increase nationwide. We don't have a lot of clear and current data on that, but I do have some graphs that are embedded in the article that goes with this podcast episode. One conclusion that I think is fair to draw is that the number of children immigrating to the U.S. right now is rising, and there are more immigrant children in public schools than in previous years. However, the total number of students enrolled in public schools is down in a large number of communities, including those with large immigrant populations. It's difficult to make predictions on how all of this will affect the needs of schools, school budgets, teacher vacancies, that sort of thing, other than to say that the need for teachers to be culturally informed and trained and supported in working with ESL students is increasingly important. Another interesting angle of the decline of students in public schools is chronic absenteeism. Students have to show up to school in order for schools to get funding for them, and a number of students have simply disappeared since the pandemic. So, in terms of what to expect, some states may need to let teachers go due to declining student enrollment and may see teachers being surplused. Other districts are going to continue to have large numbers of vacancies. And all of these circumstances are likely to be very localized. So your school may have vacancies, but another school just a few miles down the road might be laying off teachers. What we may see over the next couple of years is a sort of leveling out and shifting around of educators. There may be fewer folks entering the profession and more teachers leaving, but that could be offset by declining enrollment. The schools that typically have a lot of vacancies may have fewer as teachers are surplused or laid off from other schools. So it's hard to tell where that's going to go, but it sounds like there's going to be a lot of different circumstances happening in different places. So if what's happening in your area is not something that is working well for you and you need a different opportunity, you may be able to relocate even just to a school or district nearby that has a different set of circumstances. Now, that's a look at the state of education as a whole right now in terms of staffing and enrollment. Let's move into what's trending in K-12 education in the U.S., and then I'll share what's making me optimistic for the future of teaching. School and student safety is definitely top of the list in terms of what the priorities are. Ensuring student safety, with schools and states investing significant resources into enhancing security measures, continues to be prioritized. This includes preventing school shootings and addressing issues like substance abuse and mental health among students. However, progress in creating safe and inclusive environments does face challenges, with some proposed solutions encountering resistance and concerns about their effectiveness. In other words, we are not at a consensus about what to do. A lot of this has been politicized, unfortunately, even though it's something that really it seems like everyone should agree on is student safety, right? But we don't agree on how to get there. And that makes it harder for communities to determine what to do. I think we will continue to see significant percentages of school budgets allocated towards student safety. I would like to see a focus on educator safety as well, but that's a topic for another day. So school and student safety. Also, students' mental health is a big priority right now. This is despite budget constraints and staffing shortages. So while progress has been made in reducing the student-to-counselor ratio and the student-to-psychologist ratio, ensuring adequate support for students' emotional well-being remains a significant challenge in almost every school. And compounding the issue is our escalating culture wars, of course. Schools find themselves embroiled in controversies surrounding curriculum censorship and civil rights, legal battles over restrictions on LGBTQ+ and race-related content underscore the delicate balance that schools are trying to strike between compliance with state laws and upholding constitutional and federal mandates. The outcomes of ongoing legal battles and policy decisions will shape the trajectory of education policy and practice in the years ahead for sure. So it kind of remains to be seen on how the courts decide and what communities are advocating for. But we do know that students' mental health is a priority. And finally, post-pandemic academic recovery is a priority. And yes, we are still talking about this. Although 2023 saw disappointing academic outcomes in some areas, I think there's a growing sense of cautious optimism regarding post-pandemic academic recovery efforts. If you will allow me to shift for a moment from data to vibes, it feels like maybe the worst of the upheaval is behind us and we're starting to settle into whatever the next new normal is. Some states have reported slight improvements in test scores compared to the previous year, which is encouraging. Obviously, test scores are not everything, and they're not an accurate measure of everything that's happening in schools. But we also know persistent challenges remain, such as fluctuating enrollment levels and concerns over absenteeism. So those are a couple of priorities right now in K-12 ed: school and student safety, students' mental health, and post-pandemic academic recovery. What are the implications there? How does that impact trends and innovations? Let's get into that part now. Artificial intelligence and data privacy are definitely two big issues in the edtech space. Federal initiatives aimed at enhancing K-12 cybersecurity really highlight the seriousness of this issue. And schools are trying to safeguard sensitive information and figure out how do we navigate this and protect our kids. Quite a bit of professional development training in schools and amongst school leaders is centered around AI and will continue to be for the foreseeable future. I used to be asked to speak about AI, maybe like 1 out of every 5 speaking requests. Most of them were about student engagement or supporting teachers or fewer things better. But now I would say probably 4/5 of the speaking requests I get are centered on how to implement AI ethically in schools. I see this continuing to be a really big focus, and that's why I'm launching 40-Hour AI this summer to help support you all with resources and training about responsible incorporation of these artificial intelligence tools. I believe this will continue, and this will just become a part of the way that we do school and the way that we do life. In the same way that when smartphones were introduced around 2012 or so, it was a slow process, but over time now it became really ubiquitous, and almost everyone uses them constantly. And I think that's how AI is going to be. It's just going to be so integrated in the way our society operates that our schools will be using it as well. Now, whether that's going to be a net positive for society or for schools, that remains to be seen. But I know for sure it is here to stay. It's having a big impact. And I am optimistic about the potential for AI to ease the unsustainable burden on teachers to personalize and individualize learning. What is being asked of teachers right now in terms of simultaneously differentiating for every student's individual learning preferences, interests, skill levels, and so on, it is just not possible for one person. And yet it is a worthwhile goal. It's something that we should be striving for. So rather than to go back in time and depersonalize learning and teach like we taught in the 1950s, or continue to expect teachers to somehow work miracles and then berate the teachers when they aren't able to, I see AI as a path forward for the personalization and differentiation of learning. And I think it's really important for educators to get out ahead of this. If you will allow me to go on a brief personal rant/tangent, I know that with everything else going on, it's tempting to want to just bury your head in the sand and not deal with AI until you absolutely have to. But here's the thing. If we know that AI is going to be transformative in every aspect of the way schools operate, then we as educators need to get out ahead of it and make sure that the changes that are coming are what's best for teachers and kids. Right now, there's still a very small number of people, a disturbingly unregulated small number of people making decisions around AI. And I don't want to see tech CEOs telling us how we should be using this in schools. We need informed classroom teachers, administrators, paraprofessionals, other people who are committed to education and to kids, who understand pedagogy and best practices, who understand the students in their communities. We need us to be the leaders of change. We need to be leading this together. So if you want to have a voice in how AI is used in your school or district, if you want to feel informed about new developments and use AI in ways that make teaching more effective and efficient, I will definitely have more resources for you. 40-Hour AI will be able to help you. And you can hear the passion in my voice. This is something that I feel really strongly about. I don't want to see teachers left out of this discussion and have the change pushed on them instead of having them help shape the change. We've seen that happen way too many times, and I am determined to do my part to make sure that educators have the tools and resources they need to make good decisions for themselves, for their schools, and for their students. Okay, so I'm going to get off my soapbox now. Another big trend beyond AI that we're seeing right now in K-12 schools is what can be called the great rationalization and consolidation of instructional methods. This is the phrasing of Jeremy Cowdrey. He's the CEO of Discovery Education. And he's found that as the ESSER funds, the Emergency Relief Fund money runs out and budgets are tightening, K-12 leaders are needing to prioritize their spending in programs that have proven to driven engagement and personalized learning. And this means trimming down the multitude of EdTech resources used during the pandemic to focus on the ones that are most effective. In other words, in 2020 and 2021, we were all just sort of throwing things at the wall to see what stuck. It's like, let's try this and let's implement this and let's purchase this tech program. And now this is what Jeremy Cowdrey calls the great rationalization and consolidation of instructional materials. So the COVID purchases and the COVID curriculum, the era that's sort of like left over from that is part of this. But it's also going to look like a continued emphasis on the science of reading, as we have seen throughout this past year. That has been a huge focus, not just in schools, but the general public has really had their interest piqued in what we know about how the brain learns to read. Many schools have switched reading curriculums recently, and many more will continue to. We will also see an emphasis on proven programs for math as a way to address so-called learning loss during the pandemic. For instance, Alabama is setting up an Office of Mathematics Improvement to oversee assessments and provide additional support for K-5 students. Similarly, Florida and Louisiana are implementing interventions and professional learning programs to bolster math education for struggling students and teachers. So we're going to see districts rationalizing what they're using, really deciding, is this proven, is this working, and consolidating, cutting out the stuff that isn't most effective to save money, and also because we've just been adding so much lately. So my hope is that we can do fewer things better. My hope is that we can find what matters, focus on that, do it well. It remains to be seen exactly what that's going to look like. Another trend in education is hybrid learning and multi-classroom models for hard-to-hire subject areas. Hybrid learning may be a term that you thought or hoped that we left back in 2021, but teacher shortages may necessitate it. There is a charter network in San Jose, California, which was struggling to find qualified math and science teachers. And they have now shifted all math and science classes to virtual learning taught via Zoom. And the classes are being taught by teachers from different parts of the country. Having a larger applicant pool that isn't limited to the school's local area can help address the teacher shortage in these hard-to-hire subject areas. And it's also appealing to teachers who want to work remotely or who can only commit to teaching part-time. Personally, I kind of like this as a solution. I think it offers students the opportunities to learn from high-quality educators from around the nation, and it prevents them from languishing with long-term subs who are not trained or qualified in really critical subject areas that are important for their future. So, I would rather have them taught virtually by a really good teacher who's in a different part of the country than to have them just sitting with the sub doing busy work, basically. And also, online learning is preferred by some kids for a variety of reasons, and offering students options is a good thing typically. So they're actually in the school and they're, with their classmates. There is an adult in the room with them, but there is an instructor who is coming in via Zoom. Related, we are also seeing multi-classroom models, and this is where highly experienced teachers lead lessons across several classrooms virtually. In other words, if your school can't find a strong physics teacher locally, let's say, you can hire one that lives 3 states away to teach remotely and share the cost with 2 other schools who are also projecting the instruction live for their students. I am obviously a bit more skeptical about this approach because it is challenging enough to teach one class remotely, much less several simultaneously. However, I actually did this with my own 3rd graders. There was a special music integration into social studies program, and 5 3rd grade classes were all taught at once. And the teachers stayed in the room, so I was in the room with my class and helping to facilitate engagement, and it worked. It was something novel and interesting for the kids. I do think that it would get old after a while, and there's certainly less accountability. It's harder to assess what they're learning. There's definitely challenges there. But again, if the alternative is a long-term sub who doesn't have any background in the subject area, I would prefer a multi-classroom virtual teacher as a stopgap. Another trend is the 4-day school week. A growing number of districts over the last few years have switched to this model as a budgetary savings, especially in rural areas. With the bus driver shortage and the cost of heating or cooling schools, only bringing students into the building from Monday to Thursday can save schools a lot of money. It's also a really good approach for attracting and retaining teachers. The initial data on student outcomes is promising, I think. There's some mixed results, but a 4-day work week really needs to be approached through that fewer things better lens. You can't try to cram 5 days worth of work into 4. You have to figure out what's making the biggest impact on student learning, do only those things, and do them well. And schools that have taken this approach are seeing achievement rates that match or exceed how students were performing during a traditional 5-day work week. And to be clear, when this is done well, it does not involve a pay cut. That defeats the purpose. Hourly staff who were making $25 an hour for a 5-day work week should be making, what is the math, $32 an hour for a 4-day work week, right? Like, they should not see a pay cut. This is how you increase morale. This is how you retain employees. To make $32 an hour and only have to work 4 days a week, that's going to appeal to a lot of people, and it's going to prevent burnout. Also, when this is done well, teachers don't have their Fridays full of meetings and busy work. In some cases, teachers are also off on that 5th day. In other cases, teachers are expected to work, but remote work is an option, so they can grade papers and lesson plans from home. Regardless of whether they're working remotely or they're expected to come in, that 5th day should be mostly free for them to plan, collaborate, and assess. Sometimes the 4-day work week involves extending the school day or extending the school year. I'm not a big fan of this, particularly extending the school day, because it's already hard enough for kids to sit and focus and be engaged for 6 hours a day. Extending it to 7 is not likely to be helpful, especially if that extra hour requires kids to cram in another hour of test prep. I mean, who does their best learning from like 3 p.m. to 4 p.m. after you've been in school all day? Like, it just doesn't make sense. It does not fit with what we know about the science of learning. Extending the school year, I would prefer that to extending the school day, but I think that you have negative impacts on teacher morale, particularly for the teachers who have to work jobs in the summer to make ends meet. If you have extended the school year, now they can't do that. So a big part of moving to a 4-day work week is to attract and retain staff. So if we could still fit in those, fit things into the regular calendar year without stretching it out even more, I think that's really ideal. So I predict we will see more school districts trying out this model in the coming years. But I don't see it becoming standard unless the problem of childcare on Fridays is solved for families. If states provide funding for that, then it may offset the savings of having schools closed. So there's still lots to be determined in this area, but I'm glad to see this being an experiment because, I would like to see everybody work 4 days a week. I would like to see parents also off on Friday and to have a culture in which we're not all, putting in these insanely long hours just to pay the bills. But this is a whole nother tangent. Let's move on to the next trend, which is vo-tech training and non-college prep. There's a growing acknowledgement that the widespread push for every student to attend college has not been effective for everyone. Many students who enter bachelor's degree programs end up not finishing them, often leaving college students burdened with debt and facing really bleak outcomes in the job market. This has led to a realization that we need to reintroduce career and technical education, but without repeating the mistakes of vocational ed, which often perpetuated racial disparities through tracking systems. Now, I think this move toward vo-tech training is a really positive development. And I talked a little bit about this in episode 285 about why boys are struggling in schools. There's a lot of research to support the idea that more access to education in these vo-tech careers, instead of just college prep courses, would really improve outcomes for young men, both in their career and financial trajectory, and also in improving mental health and reducing so-called deaths of despair and drug use. So I'm encouraged by this push to ensure that all students have access to meaningful work-based learning during middle and high school. I think we need to help students explore various career paths and understand their preferences, help them learn about the requirements and realities of different careers, and develop the social connections that can help them pursue the careers that they're interested in. So this way, kids are making informed decisions about their post-high school paths, and they're able to see other paths for themselves beyond just going to college. We need blue-collar workers. We need plumbers. We need electricians. We need landscapers. There's so many jobs that kids used to have the option to train to do. We used to have shop or woodworking in high schools, right? There used to be sometimes automotive repair. You could learn to do that in school. And we've cut back and focused on the skills that are tested on standardized tests. So those programs have been cut due to budgets, and boys especially are struggling because of that. So moving back towards vo-tech education is trending, and I think that's a great thing. A final trend is non-traditional models of school. About 2 years ago, I released podcast episode 258. It was about the future of schools and what makes me hopeful. And I mentioned that I don't think it's possible to have a one-size-fits-all school anymore. From around 1930s to the 1980s, that's a very loose and generalized time frame, but from around there, the 30s to the 80s, almost every American family sent their kids to the local public school. Private schools, particularly religious schools, began to rise in popularity around the 1980s, and in the decades afterward, we've seen more emphasis on school choice, with charters, for-profits, religious schools, and secular schools of all kinds popping up as alternatives to the local public school. And my point in the podcast episode is that I don't think it's possible for one local public school to meet the needs of every family when our communities are so diverse. And I also argue that the public schools of, say, the 1950s weren't actually meeting the needs of diverse family values and cultures and so on back then. But today, parents aren't standing for that. They're speaking up about what kind of education they want for their kids. They are aware of their options. Since that episode, micro schools have really taken off, and that has confirmed my belief that the solution to making schooling work for the modern day is to let families choose the kind of learning environment that's best for their individual kids. I would like to see these options available within public schools. Because I am an advocate for our local public schools, I think they're important for our society. I think it's a net good for our society to have really strong public schools. And micro schools are a way to support public schools and support choice. So a micro school can be understood as a small-scale educational establishment that is really focused on personalized learning experiences. And there are a growing number of districts, including there's a couple that I have in mind, one in particular in Indiana, in which the microschool approach is being used in the public school system. So sometimes this looks like a choice between multiple local public schools, each with its own teaching philosophy, but more often it looks like choice within the school. So there might be a wing that's centered on STEM or a wing that's centered on arts. So it's sort of a school within a school model. I am very excited about this concept. I would love to see this applied. Okay, just dream with me here. I would love to find a way to apply this even down to the individual teacher level. We all know teachers have different instructional and classroom management styles. Rather than try to standardize that and make everyone teach the same way and run their classroom the same way, why not offer the diversity as a benefit, the choice as a benefit? If you want your child to learn in a really highly structured environment, if your kid needs a lot of they need structure, they thrive under rules, they want to know what to expect, then you want to place your kid with this teacher. If you want your child to be doing a lot of hands-on learning and moving around and, that sort of thing, then you want this teacher. If you really want your kid to be proficient in technology, you want this teacher. Parents already have an underground network of communication like this. They talk already, right? So I'm really intrigued by the possibility of making the strengths of each classroom teacher more visible so that kids can be placed with a teacher who is a good fit and whose parents are on board with that teacher's approach. That would be a game changer for teachers to feel supported by the community. If the parents are saying, this teacher has the approach that I think is going to be best for my student, and I support this teacher's method of discipline, I support this teacher's method of cell phone management in the classroom, or whatever it may be, when you find that kind of alignment, that's how you build allies with parents. So I just think there's so much potential there. And again, I could do an entire episode on that. So let's talk now about 3 positive shifts that are expected to continue. One of them is supporting teachers. And you might be asking, wait, is this actually a trend, supporting teachers? Yes, it is. And the fact that it isn't super apparent to most teachers shows you how far we still have to go, but I digress. Teacher attrition and burnout have reached levels that are pretty impossible to ignore. And more schools are stepping up efforts to support their teachers effectively. I have certainly seen this through the administrators who enroll in the 40-hour leadership program. That's the version of the 40-hour teacher work week that is for administrators. It's for school leaders. It's designed to not only streamline their workload, but also simplify systems school-wide and protect teachers' planning time, reduce paperwork and documentation, cut back on meetings, and just otherwise empower teachers to do their best work. I have definitely seen more interest over the last few years in the 40-hour leadership program from administrators who see the value in retaining talented teachers. And they know that in order to do that, they have to create environments that take care of teachers' mental health, and they have to support work-life balance. It's taking a while for this to shift, but it's a slow and steady shift where the expectation that teachers will just work evenings and weekends all the time is no longer something that most administrators assume is the status quo. And alongside this, school leaders are also rethinking how school spaces are set up to better meet the needs of teachers. They want to encourage collaboration and creativity and foster a sense of community among staff, and they're putting more effort into designing these spaces for teachers. So lots of work to be done still in this area, particularly around making structural changes to teachers' workdays instead of just telling teachers to practice self-care. But I do think we're headed in a positive direction. Another thing that makes me really optimistic in terms of the positive shifts that I see are a focus on lively and engaging learning environments. Schools are breaking away from the old-fashioned look of traditional classrooms and making them look more like coffee shops and informal gathering spaces. Now, this has been a trend in schools that serve wealthier populations for a number of years, at least 10 years or more. But we're finally seeing more support and resources for this in less affluent schools. And previously, it was on individual teachers to find, purchase, and explain why they were setting up their classrooms in that way and teaching in that way. Now it's much more common, and it's often expected and maybe even funded. Elementary classrooms have been vibrant and colorful spaces for decades, but now more emphasis on the feel of the classroom is also happening at the secondary level. These kinds of environments can have a big impact on how students feel and behave, and more secondary teachers are really tapping into the power of that. A final positive shift that makes me optimistic is the focus on accessibility and equity. We are now past the peak of the lofty DEI promises that were made by schools and organizations in 2020 and in 2021. Everybody suddenly had a DEI commitment. Hopefully, we are also now past the peak of the backlash to that. In keeping with other trends, I think our schools are trying to figure out the next new normal. And the goal for most schools is then how to meet the needs of diverse student bodies without getting caught up in the culture wars. Because regardless of the politicization of equity, the fact remains that our students represent a broad range of races, ethnicities, genders, religions, values, and so on. And our public schools are tasked with educating them all. We take them all. That's what makes public schools so amazing, is that we don't turn folks away. We take them all. And doing that in 2024 is tricky business, but it's vitally important. So despite what feels like steps backwards in some places, such as Florida and Texas in terms of equity, as a whole, schools are taking more active steps, including in those states. This is happening in certain schools to create inclusive environments that meet the diverse needs of students. And that means getting rid of barriers in education so that every student has the same opportunities and quality of education. I know we don't all agree on which approaches are best, but we do need to have that equity, that accessibility as a shared goal. Our schools are tasked with educating a greater diversity of students than ever before. These children exist, and it's our job to meet their needs. And this requires us to recognize that all kids don't have the same needs. They don't have the same lived experiences. They don't have the same cultural norms or opportunities. And I see schools really trying to work toward that, to stay out of the crossfire, to not make this a controversial thing, and just do what's best for kids. And I love seeing that. So that's a lot of information. Where do we go from there? And with all the heavy stuff that we've talked about, why am I feeling optimistic and hopeful? Well, here's why. The efforts that schools are making to accommodate diverse learners and English language learners is unprecedented. It has never been attempted before in history. The amount of personalization and accommodations that are happening for neurodivergent kids and those who learn differently, those who have special needs, unprecedented what we're doing for them. I would argue that schools are actually attempting to do more for kids than ever before. And they're succeeding a lot more than they're failing, especially given the restrictions, the budget cuts, and all the other limitations. It is amazing how much schools are accomplishing. And almost every single day, I get messages from teachers who still enjoy their jobs. They still like teaching and they don't want to switch careers. They have found ways to make the profession sustainable. And crucially, many of them have landed in schools with administrators who provide the support and resources they need. It is clear to me that teaching is not awful everywhere all the time. There is still a lot of good happening in schools. And as much criticism that public schools have received as an entity in the U.S., families continue to rate their own local public schools highly. The latest Gallup poll shows that while just 36% of Americans say they're satisfied with U.S. education, 36%, 76% of parents say they're completely or somewhat satisfied with their oldest child's education at their current school. 76% of parents are satisfied with the child's education at their current school. And this holds true even as the overall faith in the public school system has been eroded and has been intentionally eroded by those who profit from privatizing education. And this is not a new phenomenon. Contrasting views about American schools between parents and the broader public has been a long-standing phenomenon. It's been shown ever since Gallup polls began. And here's what I take from that. The general public really doesn't know what's going on inside of schools. They see clips on social media, they see stuff on certain broadcast news channels, and it forms an idea in their head. I think they work a lot of times from confirmation bias about what they assume, or they hear one anecdote and think that's what's happening everywhere. Parents tend to be more informed because they have their kids there. But a lot of people who are critiquing our schools and criticizing our schools have no connection to the schools. A lot of people at these protests and PTA meetings and stuff don't send their kids there. They don't even have kids. They don't have school-age kids. They don't work there. They're basing their opinions on something that is completely disconnected from what is actually happening in those classrooms. And the unhappy voices are always the loudest. And that's true when it comes to parent and community dissatisfaction with schools. The reality, based on both polling data, as well as what I see and hear anecdotally from thousands of teachers all over the country, is that most parents are satisfied with what's happening in their child's classroom. Many of them like their local teachers. They support them. They have good relationships with staff, and they try to be as involved as they can. That's not a minority view. The majority of parents are like that. So why not focus on what's good? Why are we always talking about all the things that schools are doing wrong and all the people who are unhappy with them, particularly the people who are unhappy and have no connection to schools whatsoever? Why not focus instead on what's working so we can replicate that in places where it's not working? We're always trying to solve problems in education. It's always a focus on the problem. Why not highlight the awesome things that are already happening so more schools have a model to follow? And that's really the heart of my work in this podcast. In a time in which the dominant messages about teaching are so discouraging, it is essential to find what's working for teachers and kids. There's so much energy to be gained from surrounding yourself with other educators who are passionate and love their jobs so that you feel supported in loving your job too. My hope, what makes me optimistic about the future of education, is in our shared collective humanity. My hope is in the work of the teachers who show up every day and do incredible work with and for their kids. There is no one coming to save us. We can be the change that we want to see in the world. What you do every day with kids matters. It's making a difference. It's changing the trajectory. Your daily work is the revolution. You are creating change. You can do this. And remember, it's not going to be easy. It's going to be worth it.